The doors of Nightfall Hall exploded open before the herald could even announce her name. King Alaric Ashbourne felt it before he saw it. A drop in temperature so sharp that the candle flames along the east wall bent sideways as if flinching from something unseen. His wineglass trembled in his hand. Across the room, 300 guests froze mid-laugh, mid-bite, mid-breath. Something powerful had just walked into his kingdom, and his wolf, the proud, unshakable beast that had never once bowed to another alpha, was already lowering its head. Before we continue, please hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Now, let's continue. Impossible, Alaric muttered. He had spent 5 years telling himself this day would never come. 5 years convincing his court, his new mate, and even his own reflection that Annie was gone for good, swallowed by the wilderness beyond the border, too broken to survive without a pack, too barren to ever be missed. Now she stood in the doorway of the hall he had once shared with her, and she was not broken. She was not even close. She wore deep midnight blue, the color of the nightfall crest, though she had no right to wear it anymore. Her dark hair was braided back in the warrior style of the northern clans. And she was not alone. 4 boys stood behind her, shoulder to shoulder, each no older than 5. Identical faces, identical stillness, and eyes, silver eyes, the exact shade that only ran in the royal bloodline of Nightfall, sweeping across the room like blades being drawn from their sheaths. Beside Alaric, his new Luna, Seraphine, rose halfway out of her chair, one hand pressed protectively over the toddler on her lap. Goose, she caught herself. Alaric, who are they? He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth had gone dry as ash. Because he knew those eyes. He had looked into eyes exactly like that every single morning for the first 3 years of his reign, in the mirror. This isn't possible, his wolf snarled inside him. She was Barren. The healers confirmed it. I confirmed it. I stood before the entire court and confirmed it myself. And yet here they were. 4 small, silent, terrifyingly composed boys, each radiating an alpha pressure that no pup should be able to produce for another 10 years, if ever. Annie walked forward, unhurried, each step landing with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago stopped needing anyone's permission to take up space. The crowd parted before her without being asked. Some bowed without realizing they were doing it, old instinct rising up through 5 years of forgetting. You look surprised, Your Majesty, Annie said, her voice calm enough to be mistaken for kindness, if you didn't know her. If you hadn't once loved her enough to memorize every version of her voice, the soft one she used at night, the sharp one she used in council, and this one, this new one, the one that had learned, somewhere far from him, exactly how much weight silence could carry. You said you would never darken my door again, Alaric managed. You invited me, she reminded him, to witness your son's naming. I simply thought it only right that you meet mine. The word landed like a blade between his ribs. Mine, not ours. She had said it on purpose, and he understood exactly why. The eldest of the 4 boys stepped half a pace forward, positioning himself slightly ahead of his brothers, the way a soldier might position himself ahead of an unarmed comrade. His silver eyes settled on Alaric with an unnerving, ancient calm that no 5-year-old should possess. Mother, the boy said quietly, is this the king who called you a wasteland? A gasp rippled through the hall. Seraphine's hand flew to her mouth. Old Elder Heiko Hollis, seated near the front, went very still, his weathered face draining of color. Alaric felt the floor tilt beneath him. Kale, Annie said gently, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. Manners. Forgive me, Mother. Kale did not sound sorry at all. He turned his silver gaze back to the king, and something ancient moved behind those young eyes, something that made even Alaric's wolf want to look away. I only wished to be certain we were bowing to the correct throne. Not one of the 4 boys bowed. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Alaric had ever heard in his life. He looked at his son Cassian, barely 2 years old, wailing now in Seraphine's arms, startled by the sudden chill in the room. He looked at his new mate, whose face had gone pale with a fear she couldn't name. And then he looked at Annie, really looked at her, the way he hadn't allowed himself to in 5 long years. And for the first time since he had dragged her before this very court, and called her broken, King Alaric Ashbourne felt something he had never once expected to feel toward the woman he had thrown away. Afraid, not of her, of what he had done to her, and of what, or who, she had brought back with her to collect the debt. "Steward," Alaric said, his voice cracking slightly as he found it again. "Set 5 more places at the high table." Annie's lips curved, just barely. Not quite a smile, not quite forgiveness, something colder and far more dangerous than either. "How generous," she said. "Come, boys. Let's see what kind of table your father sets." And as the 4 silver-eyed pups fell into step behind their mother, moving with a silent, synchronized grace that made grown warriors in the room instinctively step back, Alaric understood one terrible truth. Whatever Annie had built in the 5 years since he'd cast her out into the wild, it hadn't just survived him, it had outgrown him completely. The first course was served in a silence so heavy it felt like a living thing pressing down on every shoulder in the hall. Alaric sat at the head of the table he had once shared with Annie every night of their short marriage, now flanked by a mate who would not stop trembling, and 4 sons he hadn't known existed until 20 minutes ago. He kept sneaking glances at them, trying to find some flaw, some crack in their unnatural composure. He found none. They ate with the manners of seasoned nobility, spoke only when necessary, and moved with a mirrored precision that made his skin crawl. They're pups, he told himself. They should be squabbling over bread rolls, not sitting like small generals plotting a war. But then, pups shouldn't carry alpha auras either, and these 4 did. Dense, cold, ancient auras that had no business existing in bodies barely 5 years old. He studied Annie instead, searching for the girl he remembered. The girl who used to laugh so hard at his terrible jokes that she'd snort wine through her nose. The girl who had cried the night the healers first confirmed no pup was coming, clutching his hand and whispering, "We'll try again, we'll keep trying," while he had already, secretly, quietly, begun to doubt her. He remembered the day their bond had first ignited. He'd been 19, arrogant and untested, newly crowned after his father's death. She had walked into a border skirmish meeting uninvited, correcting his battle formation in front of 40 warriors, and he had fallen in love with her before she'd even finished her sentence. Their souls had recognized each other instantly, the old magic of fated mates blooming between them like fire catching dry grass. He had promised her forever that night. He had broken that promise in front of the entire kingdom, 3 years later, the moment her body failed to give him what his crown demanded. "You're staring, Your Majesty," Annie said without looking up from her plate. "I'm trying to understand," Alaric admitted, quieter than he meant to. "How?" "You had 5 years to ask that question with kindness," she replied. "You chose cruelty instead." Beside her, the second boy, smaller only by the way he held himself, more watchful than his brothers, lifted his silver eyes toward Alaric. His name, Alaric would soon learn, was Soren. "Your heart rate just changed, Your Majesty," Soren said politely, setting down his fork. "It does that every time you look at our mother and feel shame. It has happened 11 times since we arrived." Seraphine's fork clattered against her plate. That's not a real ability. He's guessing." Soren turned his calm gaze toward her instead. "You are lying to yourself more than to me, my lady. Your own heart has not slowed once since we walked through those doors. Guilt does that to people too, not just shame." The words hung in the air like smoke. Alaric watched color drain from Seraphine's face, watched her hand tighten protectively around baby Cassian, and felt a strange, cold unease slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the 4 boys at all. Guilt for what? He filed the question away, too proud in the moment to chase it, too rattled by everything else unraveling in front of him. "You said his name is Soren," Alaric said instead, needing to steer the conversation somewhere he could survive. And this one? He gestured to the third boy, broader through the shoulders than his brothers despite their identical age, his silver eyes calm but coiled, like a blade resting in its sheath. Ronan, Annie answered for him. And the fourth? The final boy hadn't spoken at all yet. He sat with a stillness that unsettled Alaric more than anything the others had said, his gaze moving methodically across the hall. Counting exits, Alaric realized with a chill. Counting guards. Counting every possible threat in the room, the way a seasoned commander might. Dorian, Annie said softly, and for the first time all evening, something warm slipped into her voice. Pride. Undisguised, unashamed pride. He remembers everything he has ever seen. Every conversation, every face, every mistake anyone in this room has ever made in front of him. Dorian's silver eyes flicked briefly to his mother, then back to the room, cataloguing. You raised them alone, Alaric said. It wasn't quite a question. I raised them in the wild, with no pack, no healers, and no king, Annie said, and now her voice had lost all its softness. I birthed 4 alpha-blooded sons on a bed of pine needles, while the man who was supposed to protect me was toasting his new mate's health 3 valleys away. So yes, I raised them alone. Alaric flinched as though struck. I didn't know, he said. You have to believe that. If I had known you were pregnant. You didn't ask, Annie cut in, quiet and devastating. You never once asked why my body had gone still instead of failing. You simply decided I was broken and moved on to someone easier to love. Across the table, Seraphine's spine went rigid. Alaric didn't dare look at her. The healers confirmed it, he said weakly. Master Osric examined you himself. He told the whole court. I know exactly what Osric told the court, Annie said, and something flickered behind her eyes. Something sharp and knowing that made Alaric's stomach twist with a dread he couldn't yet explain. We'll speak of Master Osric soon enough, Your Majesty. Patience. Kael, sensing the shift in his mother's tone, reached over without being asked, and refilled her water glass, his small hands steady and sure. It was such a tender, ordinary gesture, from such an unsettling child, that for one strange moment, Alaric saw not a tiny general, but simply a son who loved his mother. They're not monsters, he realized with a jolt. They're just more than any of us know what to do with. Why now? He asked finally, the question that had been eating at him since the doors first opened. 5 years of silence, and you return tonight, of all nights? Annie met his eyes fully for the first time since she'd entered the hall, and in that gaze, Alaric saw not the wounded girl he'd broken, nor the cold queen she'd become, but something far more dangerous, a woman who had already decided exactly how this evening would end, and was simply waiting, patiently, for the rest of them to catch up. Because you invited me to witness the strength of your legacy, Tugus, she said, deliberately using the old, private nickname she'd once whispered against his skin, twisting it now into something almost mocking. So I brought mine. Somewhere down the table, Elder Heiko Hollis lowered his silver head in another slow, involuntary bow, the second of the night, and Alaric understood, with a sinking, sickening certainty, that his kingdom had already begun choosing sides. And it wasn't choosing him. He thought back, unwillingly, to the morning after their bonding ceremony, when Annie had woken him before dawn, just to watch the sun rise over the training yards, her head tucked against his shoulder, her fingers tracing lazy circles over his heart. Promise me something, she'd whispered. Promise that whatever we become, we'll always tell each other the truth, even when it's hard. He had promised. He remembered promising. And then, 3 years later, when the truth had finally arrived in the form of Osric's careful, practiced lie, he had believed it without ever once asking her to explain herself in her own words. He had let a healer's report replace a wife's voice. You never asked why my body had gone still instead of failing, she had said tonight, and the accusation lodged itself somewhere deep in his chest, refusing to be dislodged. Your Majesty, Elder Heiko Hollis's voice cut gently through his spiraling thoughts. The old wolf had risen from his seat near the front of the hall, his weathered face lined with something between caution and disbelief. "If I may, I served your father for 30 years, and I have never in my life felt an aura such as the one these boys carried when they entered this hall. Might I ask, my lady, how old they truly are?" "5. This past solstice," Annie answered simply. "Impossible," Heiko murmured, though there was no accusation in it, only wonder. "Alpha auras do not manifest until the wolf's first shift, typically at 10 years, sometimes later. For 4 to manifest simultaneously, at half that age, and with such density," he shook his head slowly. "I have read every scroll in this kingdom's archive on shifter bloodlines, my lady, and I have never encountered anything resembling this." "Then perhaps Elder Hollis," Annie said, a faint, knowing curve touching her lips. "Your archive is missing a few pages." Heiko's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with the sharp, hungry curiosity of a scholar sensing a mystery worth chasing. He opened his mouth to press further, but Seraphine's voice cut across the table first, brittle and too bright. "Surely there are simpler explanations," she said. "Perhaps the boys were merely trained young. Discipline can imitate power, can it not?" "Discipline does not shatter a king's aura on contact, my lady," Ronan said quietly, not looking up from his plate. It was the first thing he had said all evening, and the flat, unbothered certainty in his young voice made even Seraphine fall silent. Alaric studied his sons again, really studied them this time, past the shock, past the fear, trying to see past the impossible power radiating off each of them to the boys underneath. Kale sat straight-backed and watchful, clearly the one his brothers deferred to without needing to be told. Soren's eyes moved constantly, reading the room the way a physician might read symptoms. Ronan ate methodically, economically, like someone who had once known hunger and never forgotten the lesson. And Dorian simply watched everything, cataloguing, missing nothing. 5 years old, Alaric thought, a fresh wave of grief rolling through him. 5 years old, and already carrying the weight of protecting their mother from a world that threw her away. "You built all of this," he said quietly to Annie, gesturing faintly toward the boys, toward her, toward the composure she wore like armor, alone, in the wild. "I had help, eventually," Annie admitted, something almost gentle slipping into her voice for the first time since she'd entered the hall. "A rogue healer took us in during that first brutal winter. A woman named Linda, who asked no questions and demanded no answers. She taught me how to keep 4 newborns alive on rabbit broth and stubbornness alone. I owe her more than I will ever be able to repay." "I would like to repay her," Alaric said, "if she still lives, whatever she needs." Annie studied him for a long moment, surprised, it seemed, by the sincerity in the offer. "She lives still, in the northern foothills. I will consider it." It was such a small thing, an offer, a consideration, and yet it was the first true exchange between them all evening that hadn't been laced with old wounds, and Alaric found himself grasping at it the way a drowning man grasps at driftwood. 5 years earlier, rain hammered the stone walls of Nightfall Hall the night everything ended, and Annie would remember, for the rest of her life, the exact sound her own heartbeat made as it cracked in half. "Kneel," Alaric had said, and even now, 5 years later, the word still echoed in her dreams. Not because it was cruel, but because of how calm he'd sounded saying it, as though he'd rehearsed it, as though he'd already made peace with what he was about to do to her. She had knelt anyway, because she still loved him, because some foolish, hopeful part of her still believed that if she simply proved her devotion one more time, he would remember who they used to be to each other. 3 years, Elder Osric had announced to the gathered court, his healer's robes crisp and clean, his voice carrying the practiced sorrow of a man delivering news he did not actually feel. 3 years of trying, my king, and Luna Annie's body shows no sign of ever quickening. I regret to confirm what the elders have long suspected. She is barren. The word had rippled through the hall like poison through water. Annie remembered looking up at Alaric from her knees, searching his face for even a flicker of doubt, of hesitation, of the boy who had once memorized the exact color her eyes turned when she was happy. She found nothing. Only a king protecting his crown. "The bloodline of Nightfall cannot end with me," Alaric had said, and his voice had shaken. She remembered that too, had clung to that small tremor for years afterward, wondering if it meant something, wondering if some part of him had hated himself even as he did it. "I release you from our bond, Annie of the Frostvale line. You are no longer Luna of this pack." The bond break had torn through her like claws through silk, a physical agony that dropped her fully to the floor, her whole body convulsing as 5 years of soul-deep magic was ripped out by the root. She remembered screaming. She remembered Alaric standing over her, his jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists at his sides, making no move to help her up. She remembered, most of all, that he did not cry. He recalled the way she had wept silently. He would tell himself for years afterward, rewriting the memory into something softer, something that let him sleep at night. The way her scent had soured with heartbreak before she vanished into the night. He never let himself remember the part where he'd watched, unmoving, as 2 guards half-dragged her out into the storm. He never let himself remember that she had been 3 weeks pregnant with 4 alpha-marked sons at the exact moment he called her a wasteland, that her body had already been quietly working the deepest, oldest kind of magic her bloodline possessed, drawing every ounce of her strength inward to protect what was growing there, hiding it even from herself, because some ancient instinct in her blood had already sensed that the world outside was not safe for what she carried. She had walked 3 days through the northern woods with nothing but the torn remains of her ceremonial gown and a hunting knife she'd stolen from a sleeping guard. She had built a fire with shaking hands on the second night, and it was there, alone, freezing, abandoned by the only pack she'd ever known, that she finally understood the truth her body had been keeping from her. She was not Barren. She was carrying life. 4 lives. And not one soul in Nightfall Hall would ever be trusted with them again. "I will not let them grow up in a kingdom that would have called them a wasteland too," she had whispered to her own belly that night, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I promise you, whatever it costs me, I will make you strong enough that no one will ever throw you away." Present day. Annie blinked, and the memory receded, leaving her staring across the banquet table at the man she had once nearly died for. Alaric was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in 5 years. Not the cold authority of a king, but the raw, unguarded grief of the boy she'd once fallen in love with. "You're remembering it," he said quietly. "I can see it on your face." "I remember everything about that night," Annie said. "Every word, every second you chose not to help me off that floor." His jaw tightened. "I have relived that night every day since, if I could undo it." "You can't," she said simply, without cruelty, which somehow made it hurt worse. "Some things, once broken, don't go back together the same shape as before." Cale, sensing the tremor in his mother's composure, reached over and rested his small hand over hers on the table, a silent, steady anchor. Annie exhaled slowly, gathering herself. "I would speak with you," Alaric said, low enough that only she could hear. "Alone. Please, Annie. Not as a king to his exile. As," he faltered, "as whatever is left of what we used to be." Annie studied him for a long moment, silver blue eyes unreadable. Then she glanced at Soren, who gave the smallest, most deliberate nod, a nod that told her, without words, that whatever Alaric intended to say in private, he intended to say it honestly. "Very well," Annie said, rising gracefully from her chair. "Bennett, Cale, watch your brothers." "Yes, mother," Cale said, and something in the way all 4 boys straightened in unison told Alaric that whatever conversation was about to happen behind closed doors, his sons would know every word of it before the night was through. He didn't understand yet how. He would. The antechamber smelled of dried roses and old parchment, the same as it had 5 years ago, and Annie felt the memory of it settle over her like a familiar, unwelcome coat. Alaric closed the heavy door behind them, muting the low hum of the banquet hall to a distant murmur. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The last time they had stood in this room together, he had been telling her their marriage was over. She wondered, bitterly, what fresh wound he intended to open tonight. "You look well," Alaric said finally, which was such a small, foolish thing to say that Annie almost laughed. "I look like a woman who survived you," she said instead. "There's a difference." He flinched, but didn't argue. "The boys, their powers. I've never seen anything like it, not in scrolls, not in legend. Kale commands obedience, without even raising his voice. Soren hears lies like other people hear thunder. Ronan lifted a stone bench with one hand at supper. Annie, a stone bench. And Dorian, he shook his head, still visibly rattled. Dorian looks at a room and seems to already know how every person in it will move 3 steps from now. They are exactly what 5 years of surviving without a father taught them to become, Annie said. Each of them learned to protect what the others couldn't. Where did their power come from? Alaric asked, and there was something almost desperate in the question now. My bloodline carries the silver eyes. Yes, but nothing like this. Nothing like what I felt when they walked into that hall. Annie was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth this man had earned. Do you remember my mother? She asked finally. She died when you were young. You rarely spoke of her. Because I rarely understood her, Annie said. My mother's line is old, Alaric. Older than nightfall. Older than most packs still standing. We called it the first lunar bloodline once, though the name has been forgotten by everyone but the deep archives and a few dying elders. It sleeps in most who carry it. Thin, quiet, barely a whisper of power, passed down through generations of women who never needed to wake it. And you woke it. I didn't choose to, she said. The night you severed our bond, something in me broke that was never meant to break gently. My magic turned inward, to protect what was growing inside me, instead of shattering completely. It took every ounce of strength my body possessed to shelter 4 lives at once, Guus Air. The healers who called me Barren weren't wrong because they were foolish. Her eyes sharpened. They were wrong because they were never meant to see the truth in the first place. Alaric's brow furrowed. What do you mean, never meant to? Annie hesitated, and for the first time all evening, Alaric saw something crack in her composure. Not sorrow this time, but something colder. Calculation. Caution. I mean exactly what I said, she replied carefully. We'll speak more of it when the time is right. Tonight is not that night. Annie. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the old, familiar warmth of him, close enough that some traitorous part of her chest ached with a longing she despised herself for still feeling. I know I don't deserve your trust. I threw it away with my own hands. But something is wrong in this court. I felt it the moment Soren looked at Seraphine tonight. I need to know what you know. Before Annie could answer, a soft, precise voice cut through the tension. Mother. Soren stood in the doorway, having slipped in so quietly neither of them had heard the door open. His small face was calm, but his silver eyes carried a weight far beyond his years. Forgive the intrusion. Elder Heiko Hollis has brought forth a matter for the king's judgment, as tradition demands during a naming ceremony. Alpha Torvin of the Ridgewood Pack awaits an audience. Annie studied her son for a long beat, some silent understanding passing between them that Alaric couldn't quite follow. Is there something else, Soren? She asked. Master Osric left the hall 11 minutes ago, Soren said quietly. He has not returned. His heartbeat, when I last measured it, was faster than any lie I have heard tonight. Something cold slid down Alaric's spine. Osric left? He repeated. During a royal audience? That's forbidden without the king's leave. Annie's expression sharpened into something hard and focused, the softness of moments ago gone entirely. Then perhaps, Your Majesty, she said, moving past him toward the door. It's time we found out exactly what your royal healer is so afraid we'll discover." Alaric followed her out of the antechamber, his heart hammering with a dread he couldn't yet name, unaware that the true unraveling of his kingdom had only just begun, and that the woman he'd spent 5 years trying to forget was the only person standing between his crown and a conspiracy that had started long before he ever met her at all. Alpha Torvin's voice boomed across the banquet hall as Alaric resumed his throne, Annie and her sons taking their places at the high table once more. "Your Majesty, the Eastern River Basin has run dry 3 seasons early. The Silverhide clan has begun crossing onto Ridgewood land to hunt, and my warriors have clashed with them twice this week. I request a battalion to drive them back before they claim a permanent foothold." It was the kind of request Alaric had granted a dozen times before, without hesitation. Brutal, simple pack law. Strength answers threat. "Granted," he began. "Take 50 of the royal." "A costly and unnecessary decision," Dorian's voice cut in, calm and clear, though he had not raised it at all. The hall went still. Torvin's mouth fell open. "You question a royal decree, pup," Torvin managed. Dorian folded his small hands neatly on the table, entirely unbothered by the burly Alpha's incredulous stare. "You said the river dried 3 seasons early, Alpha Torvin. Have you asked why?" It's simply a dry season," Torvin stammered. "A river that large does not dry 3 seasons early, without something blocking its source," Dorian said patiently, as though explaining sums to a small child rather than correcting a seasoned war commander. "The Silverhide clan is not invading your land for sport. Their own dens have almost certainly flooded from whatever now dams the river upstream. They are not enemies at your border, Alpha Torvin. They are refugees." A ripple of astonished murmurs swept the hall. "If you burn their camps as you intend," Dorian continued, "you will force starving wolves to fight for their pups' lives. You will lose dozens of your own warriors to a battle that never needed to happen, and you will inherit a poisoned river besides. War is expensive, Alpha Torvin, not merely in blood, in everything a kingdom needs to survive the winter after." "Then what would you have me do, little lord?" Torvin asked, his earlier outrage melting into something closer to fascination. "Offer them the Eastern Ridge for hunting rights," Dorian said, "in exchange for their labor clearing the blockage upstream. You gain a workforce, restore your water, avoid a war you cannot afford, and indebt a neighboring clan to Nightfall's crown besides. True strength is not measured by how much blood you're willing to spend. It is measured by how much you can gain without spending any at all." The silence that followed was not fear this time. It was awe. Alaric sat frozen on his throne, watching Torvin nod slowly, watching Elder Heiko Hollis lean forward with open admiration, watching his entire court quietly reconsider everything they thought they understood about strength, and realizing, with a hollow ache in his chest, that a 5-year-old had just outmaneuvered every war council he'd ever assembled. Seraphine, watching the tide of the room shift once again away from her mate, felt something desperate claw up her throat. She needed to reclaim the room. She needed the court to remember that whatever these strange, brilliant boys were, they were still stateless, still rootless, still less. "Clever words for a child raised in the wild," she said, forcing a light, condescending laugh into her voice. "Tell me, Annie, it must be so difficult raising 4 boys without a treasury behind you. Do you rely on the kindness of traders to survive out there?" Annie took a slow, unhurried sip of her wine, entirely unbothered. "Charity," she said, "is only a necessity for those who never learned to build anything of their own." Ronan, quiet until now, set down his fork with deliberate care. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, faintly bored, the expression of someone forced to correct an obvious mistake. "The assumption that Nightfall provides superior security is incorrect," he said. His voice, unlike his brother's, carried a low, steady weight, like stone settling into place. "Based on the tarnish on your palace guard's armor and the thinness of tonight's venison portions, your treasury has run at a deficit for at least 3 seasons, my lady. The king's border conflicts have drained your grain reserves dangerously low. Seraphine's face drained of color. Down the table, several of the kingdom's merchants and financiers exchanged stunned, uneasy glances. The boy had spoken a truth few outside the treasury office were meant to know at all. Our mother did not need a treasury, Ronan continued, unbothered by the shockwave he'd caused. She built a trade in rare northern herbs that the healing guilds pay handsomely for. Our household's holdings now exceed Nightfall's royal treasury threefold. A collective gasp swept the hall. Alaric stared at Annie, something raw and aching blooming behind his ribs. She had not simply survived the wilderness he'd cast her into. She had built an empire out of it, quietly, patiently, without a single soul in this kingdom noticing, until tonight. Master Osric would know our finances better than most, Annie said suddenly, her voice deceptively light, though her eyes had gone sharp as knives. Where is your royal healer this evening, Your Majesty? I find I have several questions for him. Alaric turned to the empty seat near the front of the hall, where Osric usually sat during royal gatherings, and a slow, sick understanding began to dawn. Guards, Alaric said, his voice tight. Find Master Osric, now. But it was already too late, because 2 floors above the banquet hall, in the locked privacy of his private chambers, Master Osric Vane was not hiding. He was writing a letter, sealed with shaking hands, addressed to a mercenary captain he had paid handsomely 5 years ago to make sure a certain exiled Luna never survived the winter woods at all. He had failed once. Tonight, watching those 4 impossible, silver-eyed boys dismantle his careful decade of lies in a single conversation, Osric intended to make sure he did not fail again. Soren felt it before anyone else did, a spike of raw, animal panic threading through the hall's usual hum of pheromones, sharp enough to cut through even the roasted meat and spilled wine. "Mother," he said quietly, setting down his water glass. "Someone in this castle is afraid enough to do something foolish." Annie's spine straightened instantly. "Where?" Soren closed his eyes, focusing the way she'd taught him during long winter nights in the northern woods, not merely listening for lies, but listening for the frantic, telltale rhythm of a heart preparing to act on desperation. Above us, the healer's tower. Alaric was already rising from his throne. Osric's chambers are on the 2nd floor of the eastern tower. He turned to the captain of his guard. "Seal the castle gates. No one leaves without my word." But Annie moved faster than any of them, already sweeping toward the hall's side entrance, her 4 sons falling into perfect step behind her without needing to be told. "You don't have to come," Alaric said, catching up to her in the corridor, guards scrambling behind him. "He tried to have me killed once," Annie said flatly, not slowing her pace. "I intend to look him in the eye when we finish this." Alaric stumbled slightly. "Killed?" "Later," Annie said. "Focus, Your Majesty." They reached Osric's chamber door to find it locked from within. Ronan didn't bother knocking. One firm press of his small palm against the heavy oak sent it splintering inward off its hinges, the wood cracking apart like dry kindling. Osric spun from his writing desk, ink-stained fingers trembling around a half-finished letter, his ceremonial healer's robes rumpled with panic. "Your Majesty," he stammered, I was simply attending to—" "Sit down, Osric," Annie said, and something in her voice made even Alaric's skin prickle. Cale stepped forward and fixed his silver eyes on the trembling healer. "Sit," he said quietly, not a threat, not a shout, simply a single word, carrying an undeniable weight that pressed down on the room like a hand on the back of the neck. Osric's knees buckled. He sat, hard, in his own chair, visibly horrified at his body's instant obedience to a command from a child he outweighed by 4 times over. "What?" Osric gasped. "What are they?" "Consequences," Annie said simply. She crossed the room and lifted the unfinished letter from his desk before he could stop her, scanning it quickly. Her face went very still. "Read it," she said, handing it wordlessly to Alaric. Alaric's hands shook as he read the healer's cramped, panicked handwriting. A message addressed to a mercenary captain named Voss, offering a fortune in gold for the swift, quiet removal of the woman and her 4 unnatural sons before dawn. "You've done this before," Alaric said slowly, looking up, something cold and murderous sliding into his voice. "Haven't you? 5 years ago." Osric said nothing, but Soren's small voice cut through the silence like a struck bell. "His heart just told the truth for the first time tonight, Your Majesty," Soren said quietly. "Yes, he has." "Explain," Alaric said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Now, Osric, every word of it." Osric's composure finally shattered entirely. "It was never meant to be like this," he said, his voice cracking. "I was only asked to make certain the Luna never conceived. A simple thing, moonlace suppressant, hidden in her nightly tea for 3 years, nothing more than a delay. When she failed to quicken, the accusation of barrenness would follow naturally, and the crown would be free to seek a more favorable match." "A favorable match," Alaric repeated hollowly. His eyes cut sideways, and Osric flinched. "Not merely for the kingdom's sake," Osric admitted, shrinking under the weight of the king's stare. "My daughter's marriage into the royal line would secure our family's standing for 100 years. It was Seraphine's own mother who first proposed it to me, years before you ever laid eyes on her, Your Majesty. We simply needed the Frostvale Luna out of the way." Alaric's face went white with fury. "You poisoned my mate, my pregnant mate, to arrange a political marriage. I did not know she carried pups," Osric said quickly, desperately. "None of us did. Her body concealed them so completely, even I could not detect it. When she vanished into exile, I assumed the matter closed. I hired Voss's men to ensure it stayed closed, in case she survived long enough to speak the truth of what had been done to her. And tonight," Annie said quietly, "when she returned alive, with 4 sons no lie could explain away, you decided to try again." Osric said nothing. He didn't need to. Alaric turned away from the healer, pressing both hands over his face, his broad shoulders shaking with something between rage and grief. Every terrible thing he had done to Annie, the humiliation, the bond break, the 5 years of silence, all of it had been built on a lie, manufactured by a man he had trusted with his own health, his own family, his own crown. "I believed her Barren because you told me to believe it," Alaric said, his voice raw. "I threw away the only woman I have ever truly loved because you poisoned her and let me think it was her failure instead of your crime." "Your Majesty, you will answer for this," Alaric said, and there was nothing of the uncertain, guilt-ridden man from moments ago left in his voice now. Only the cold, absolute authority of a king who had just found something worth being ruthless for. But not tonight. "Tonight, Master Osric, you're going to help us find Captain Voss before he acts on that letter." Annie's silver-blue eyes met Alaric's over the healer's bowed, trembling head, and for the first time since she'd walked back through the doors of Nightfall Hall, something passed between them that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite enmity either. It was, perhaps, the beginning of an uneasy truce. It would not last the night. They never made it back to the banquet hall. The attack came from the servants' corridor, 6 hired blades moving with the brutal efficiency of men who'd been paid enough not to hesitate, Captain Voss at their head, his scarred face set in grim determination. Osric's letter had never been sent, but the healer's earlier, desperate note from hours before had already reached its mark. Voss had been waiting in the castle since before the naming ceremony even began, watching, biding his time for exactly this kind of chaos. "There," Voss growled, spotting Annie and her sons in the narrow corridor, Alaric and 2 guards beside them. "Kill the woman and the boys. Leave the king." The guards drew steel, but the mercenaries moved faster, closing the gap in a blur of motion. Alaric lunged forward with a roar, but he was still a half-step too slow, too far, too human against 6 trained blades. He never reached them. He didn't need to. Cale stepped in front of his mother without a flicker of hesitation, his small chin lifted, his silver eyes locking onto the nearest attacker. "Stop," he said. Not shouted, not screamed, simply spoken, with the same absolute, bone-deep authority he'd used on Osric. The lead mercenary's sword arm froze mid-swing, his entire body locking rigid, as though every muscle had simultaneously forgotten how to obey him. He crashed sideways into the stone wall, more stunned by his own body's betrayal than by any blow. Ronan didn't wait for an opening. He crossed the distance between himself and the second attacker in a single fluid motion, catching the man's descending blade arm at the wrist. There was a sharp, startled cry as the mercenary's own considerable strength was turned against him, his own momentum flinging him bodily into a stone pillar. He did not get back up. Soren ducked low beneath a wild swing, reading the attacker's next three moves in the shift of his weight before the man himself had decided them, and simply wasn't where the blade landed. A precise strike to the back of the knee sent the third mercenary crashing down, disarmed before he understood what had happened. Dorian, meanwhile, had already calculated the corridor's geometry. "Mother, left passage, now," he said calmly, and Annie moved instantly, trusting her son's judgment without question, sweeping past the fighting toward the narrow side hall Dorian had identified as the safest path, directly into the arms of two more mercenaries Voss had stationed as backup. For one horrifying instant, Alaric's heart stopped entirely. But Dorian had already anticipated it. "Ronan," he said simply. Ronan was already moving, closing the gap before either backup mercenary could raise a blade, sweeping both men off their feet with a single powerful motion and pinning them to the stone floor with a strength that should have been physically impossible for a child his size. Voss, seeing 4 of his 6 men down in under 15 seconds, snarled and lunged directly for Alaric instead, calculating, correctly, that the king was the only target in the corridor without an impossible child protecting him. Alaric met the blade with his forearm, hissing as steel bit through fabric and skin, but he did not fall back. Years of war training took over, and he drove his shoulder into Voss's chest, slamming the mercenary captain hard into the stone wall. "Who sent you?" Alaric snarled, pinning Voss's sword arm with brutal force. "Beyond Osric. Who else knew?" Voss spat blood and laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "You'll never. He is telling the truth about not knowing more names," Soren said quietly from a few feet away, having finished securing the last conscious mercenary with a length of curtain cord. "But he is lying about something else, Your Majesty. Ask him who paid for tonight specifically." Alaric's grip tightened. "Who?" Voss's bravado finally cracked. "The healer's letter came with a name already attached," he gasped. "A backup patron, in case Osric lost his nerve. Lady Vane's own steward delivered the second half of my payment personally, not 2 hours ago." The corridor went silent. Alaric turned slowly and found Seraphine standing frozen at the far end of the hallway, having followed the commotion from the banquet hall, her face white as bone, baby Cassian clutched tight against her chest. "Seraphine," Alaric said, his voice dangerously quiet, "tell me that isn't true." For a long, terrible moment, Seraphine said nothing at all, and in her silence, Alaric heard every answer he needed. Behind him, Voss let out another wet, ugly laugh, blood staining his teeth. "Go on then, Your Majesty," he rasped. "Ask her how deep it runs. Ask her how long she's known her father's dealings, and how long she chose comfort over honesty." "Silence," Cale said, and this time there was real steel beneath the single word. Voss's jaw snapped shut against his will, his own body betraying him mid-sentence, and the mercenary's eyes went wide with genuine terror for the first time all night. Alaric knelt briefly beside one of the fallen guards, checking a shallow wound before waving him toward the healer's wing, his mind racing through the wreckage of the evening. 6 trained blades, a castle supposedly secure, and somehow 4 small boys had ended the entire assault without a single serious injury among them. "How?" he said finally, turning to Annie, his voice hoarse with something between awe and disbelief. "How do they fight like that? Like they've rehearsed 100 times." "They have," Annie said simply. "Not against men, not until tonight. but against wolves, twice their size, in the wild, where a single mistake meant one of them didn't survive the season. I trained them the moment they could walk. I had no choice. There was no one else to protect them but each other. Alaric absorbed that in silence, the picture forming in his mind almost too painful to hold. 4 toddlers, alone in the wilderness with their mother, learning to fight not for sport, not for glory, but simply to be allowed to keep breathing. "I should have been there," he said quietly. "Yes," Annie agreed, without cruelty, simply stating a fact neither of them could change. "You should have." Dorian, finished securing the last of Voss's men, straightened and looked toward his mother. "There is one more matter, mother," he said. "Voss did not act entirely alone tonight. 2 of his men mentioned, before Ronan subdued them, that they were told to expect resistance from the king's guard, not from us. Someone briefed them on this castle's patrol patterns, someone with access to the guard rotations." Alaric's blood ran cold. That information is only shared among the royal council and the captain of the guard. "Then I would suggest, Your Majesty," Dorian said calmly, "that your investigation does not end with Master Osric and Lady Vane's steward alone." The weight of that realization settled over the corridor like a fresh blade. Alaric looked at Seraphine, still kneeling with Cassian, and then past her, down the long stone hallway toward the banquet hall, where dozens of his most trusted nobles were still waiting, unaware of how close the night had come to ending in bloodshed. "Then we finish this properly," Alaric said, straightening his spine, some of the old authority returning to his voice. Not the arrogant, brittle command of a king protecting his pride, but something steadier now, something that had been forged, in the span of a single terrible evening, into someone willing to actually listen. Every guard rotation reviewed. Every name Osric and Voss can give us, followed to its root. I will not let this kingdom hide behind comfortable lies again. Annie watched him say it, watched the shift in his bearing, and said nothing. But something in her expression, some old guarded corner of it, softened by the smallest possible degree. "I didn't know it would go this far," Seraphine said, her voice trembling as she sank to her knees in the corridor, still clutching Cassian tight. "My father told me only that Annie's exile needed to remain permanent, that if she ever returned and spoke the truth of what had been done to her, everything we'd built would collapse. I never asked what that meant. I didn't want to know." "You paid a mercenary to kill a woman and her children," Alaric said, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "Our children slept 2 floors above where you signed that order." "I didn't sign anything," Seraphine said desperately. "I only told my father's steward not to interfere if father needed assistance. I told myself it was only insurance. I told myself it would never actually be used." "That is not entirely a lie," Soren said quietly, his young face troubled in a way it hadn't been all evening. "But it is not entirely the truth either." Annie, still holding her sons close, studied Seraphine for a long moment, not with hatred, though she had every right to it, but with something closer to weary recognition. She had once been a young woman terrified of losing everything too. "You knew what your father did to me 5 years ago," Annie said. "The poison, the false diagnosis. Did you know that, at least?" Seraphine flinched, and that flinch was answer enough. "I suspected," she whispered. "I never let myself confirm it. I told myself the crown wanted an heir, and I was simply the woman fate had chosen to provide one. It was easier than admitting I'd built my entire life on someone else's stolen one." Cassian, sensing his mother's distress, began to whimper. Desmond, Dorian, watching quietly this whole time, finally moved. He crossed the corridor and, without a word, gently touched the toddler's small hand, a strange calm settling over the crying boy almost instantly. "He is not guilty of anything," Dorian said, looking up at his mother. "Whatever happens to the rest of this, he is only a baby, and he is our brother, whether anyone in this hallway wishes to admit it or not." The simple, unguarded honesty of it, a 5-year-old choosing kinship over vengeance, comforting a rival's child without being asked, struck the corridor into stunned silence. Annie closed her eyes briefly, something in her chest finally loosening after 5 long years of carrying grief like armor. "He's right," she said quietly. "Cassian is innocent in all of this. Whatever is decided about the rest of you, he deserves better than to grow up carrying his mother's mistakes." Alaric stared at his sons he had known for less than a day, watching them extend a grace towards Seraphine's child that he himself had never once offered Annie when it might have mattered. "There's something else," Annie said suddenly, straightening. She looked down at her own hands, silver blue eyes distant, as though listening to something none of the rest of them could hear. "Osric said my body concealed the pregnancy from him completely. That's not merely a mother's magic protecting her sons. That's something older." She lifted her palm, and for the first time in 5 years, allowed herself to stop suppressing the power she'd spent so long teaching herself to hide. Silver-white light bloomed from her skin, gentle as moonlight, spreading in slow, ancient patterns across the stone corridor. Patterns that matched, exactly, the faint silver marks each of her 4 sons carried at the base of their necks, hidden beneath their collars. "The first lunar bloodline," Annie said softly. "My mother's line. Not merely dormant magic, but a power older than Nightfall's crown itself. One that only wakes fully when a woman of that blood finds her true fated mate and is wounded deeply enough by the bond's betrayal to need it." Her eyes flicked to Alaric, something bittersweet and complicated passing across her face. "You didn't just father 4 alpha heirs, Guus. You broke a bond so completely that it woke something in my blood that hasn't stirred in 300 years. Alaric stared at the softly glowing marks on his sons' necks, at the ancient, silver light still pulsing gently from Annie's palm, and understood, with dizzying clarity, that everything he had believed about his own bloodline's superiority, the arrogance that had let him call her a wasteland in the first place, had been built on an ignorance so vast it was almost laughable. Her power hadn't come from him. It had always been hers. He had simply been the wound that woke it. "Osric knew," Alaric said slowly. "That's why he was so desperate to keep you gone. Not because of a political marriage, because if the first lunar bloodline ever woke and returned to Nightfall, it would outshine any crown built on silver eyes alone," Annie finished. "Yes." Behind them, Voss groaned where he lay bound on the stone floor, and Seraphine still knelt with her son, tears tracking silently down her face. Not for herself, Alaric realized, but for the terrible weight of finally understanding exactly what her family's ambition had cost. "What happens now?" Seraphine asked quietly. Annie let the silver light fade slowly from her hands, looking down at the trembling young Luna and her innocent, wide-eyed son with something that was, against all odds, almost gentle. "Now," Annie said, "we go finish what we started in that banquet hall. Because I did not survive 5 winters in the wild, wake a 300-year-old bloodline, and raise 4 sons capable of dismantling a conspiracy in a single evening, simply to hide in a servant's corridor while the truth waits for permission to be spoken." She turned to Alaric, silver eyes steady and unflinching. "Are you ready to finally tell your court the truth, Your Majesty, all of it?" Alaric looked at the woman he had broken, the sons he hadn't known to protect, and the crown he now understood he had never fully deserved to wear alone. "Yes," he said quietly, "it's long past time." The banquet hall had descended into anxious murmurs by the time the small procession returned. Alaric with a bloodied forearm, Annie with her 4 sons flanking her, a bound and disgraced Osric marched between 2 guards, and Seraphine trailing behind, pale and silent, still holding Cassian close. Alaric climbed the dais steps alone and raised a hand for silence. It took only a moment. The hall had already learned, in the span of one extraordinary evening, exactly whose presence commanded a room. 5 years ago, Alaric began, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned hall, I stood on this very dais and called my mate Barren. I severed our bond in front of this entire court and cast her out into the wild to die, all to protect a crown I believed was more important than the woman wearing it beside me. Gasps rippled through the gathered nobility. Elder Heiko Hollis leaned forward, his weathered face taut with rapt attention. "I was wrong," Alaric continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Not simply mistaken, deceived, poisoned lies, fed to me by a man I trusted with my own health, orchestrated to remove a Luna whose bloodline threatened to outshine my own." He gestured toward the bound healer. "Master Osric Vane will answer for his crimes before the full council. Tonight." He turned then, and for the first time since she had walked back through those doors, King Alaric Ashbourne descended the dais steps and knelt, not as a king performing contrition for his court's benefit, but as a man laying down every ounce of pride he had left. "Annie," he said, and his voice was raw, stripped of every royal pretense. "I cannot undo 5 years. I cannot give back the winters you survived alone, or the birth you endured without a healer's hand, or the years our sons spent not knowing what it was to have a father who deserved them. I can only tell you, in front of everyone who watched me throw you away, that I was wrong about everything that mattered." The hall held its breath. "I am not asking you to forget," Alaric said. "I am asking for the chance to become someone worth remembering differently." Annie studied him for a long, unbearable moment, 4 silver-eyed sons standing silently at her sides, and Alaric understood, with a lurch of genuine fear, that this was not a moment he could win through speeches alone. She had built an empire without him. She did not need his crown, his apology, or his throne. Whatever she chose now, she would choose freely. "You hurt me in ways I am still learning to survive," Annie said finally, quiet enough that only the front rows could hear. "You did not simply doubt my body. You doubted me, my worth, my loyalty, everything I had given you for 3 years without complaint. A crown built on that kind of doubt was never one I wanted to wear beside you, even when I loved you enough to try." Alaric's shoulders dropped, grief written plainly across his face. "But," Annie continued, and something in her voice shifted, softening just slightly, "I also watched you kneel on this floor tonight, not to reclaim a queen, but to tell the truth, in front of the people whose respect you could have simply kept by staying silent. That is not the same man who let 2 guards drag me into a storm 5 years ago." "What are you saying?" Alaric asked, hope and fear warring plainly across his face. "I am saying that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting," Annie said, "and I am not yet certain which one I am ready to offer you. But I am saying that our sons deserve to know their father, the real one, not the crown he hides behind. And I find, against every hard lesson these 5 years taught me, that some small, stubborn part of me still wants to know if the boy I fell in love with at 19 still exists somewhere beneath the king who broke my heart." It was not a yes. It was not a no, either. It was, Alaric realized, an opening. Narrow, fragile, and entirely more than he deserved. "Then let me earn it," he said quietly. "Not tonight, not with a single kneel and a single speech. Let me earn it the way you earned everything you built out there in the wild. Slowly, honestly, one true thing at a time." Cale studied his father for a long, searching moment, silver eyes weighing him the way he'd weighed every threat in the room that evening. Then, for the first time all night, something in the boy's rigid composure softened, just slightly. "He means it, Mother," Cale said quietly. "His heart is telling the truth. Soren would say so too, if you asked him." "He would," Soren confirmed simply. Annie looked down at her sons, the 4 impossible, extraordinary boys she had built from nothing but grief, moonlight, and stubborn love, and then back at the man kneeling before her, waiting for a verdict she had not yet decided how to give. "Rise, Your Majesty," she said finally. "A king does not kneel in his own hall forever, no matter how much he deserves it." Alaric rose slowly, and as he did, Elder Heiko Hollis, the first to bow to Annie that evening, stepped forward and knelt himself before the returned Luna, his voice carrying clearly across the transformed hall. "Whatever is decided between the king and his Luna," the old elder said, "this court owes Lady Annie Frostvale an apology 5 years overdue. We watched her be cast out and said nothing. We will not make that mistake twice." One by one, The gathered nobility of Nightfall lowered their heads, not out of fear of 4 impossible boys this time, but out of genuine, hard-won respect for the woman who had survived everything they'd let happen to her, and returned not for revenge, but for truth. The morning sun rose gently over Nightfall Hall 3 weeks later, gilding the frost-tipped pines beyond the castle walls in soft gold light, and for the first time in 5 years, Annie Frostvale watched a sunrise from inside the walls of the pack that had once thrown her away. Master Osric Vane had been stripped of his title and exiled to the northern penal colonies, his crimes laid bare before the full council. Captain Voss and his surviving mercenaries had been handed over to the Crown's justice. And Seraphine, after weeks of anguished, honest reckoning, had made a choice that surprised the entire court. "I don't want to fight for a throne I never should have accepted," Seraphine had told Alaric and Annie quietly, Cassian asleep in her arms. "I want to raise my son somewhere he isn't a symbol of a wound this pack is still healing from. There's a smaller pack to the south, allied to Nightfall, that needs a steady hand. I've asked for the position of regent there. Cassian can grow up knowing his brothers without growing up in the shadow of what my father did to earn him a crown." It was not the ending anyone in the hall that terrible night could have predicted. No banishment, no bitter rivalry stretched across years. Just 2 women, wounded by the same man's mistakes and the same conspiracy, choosing something quieter and wiser than revenge. Annie had agreed to remain in Nightfall, not yet as Luna again, but as something new the pack had never quite had a name for before. An equal, independent voice on the royal council. Her sons formally recognized as princes of the bloodline, regardless of what she and Alaric ultimately decided between themselves. As for Alaric, he had spent 3 weeks proving, in small and unglamorous ways, that his kneel in the banquet hall had not simply been performance. He had restructured the treasury, according to Dorian's careful analysis, ended the pointless border conflict with Ridgewood on Bennett's, on Dorian's terms, and quietly, every single evening, without fail, made time to sit with his sons and simply listen, learning who they were beyond their extraordinary powers. He learned that Cale, for all his commanding presence, loved quiet mornings and hated being the center of attention when it wasn't necessary. He learned that Soren, who could hear a lie from across a crowded hall, struggled most with trusting his own instincts about kindness, having spent so long guarding his mother against cruelty. He learned that Ronan, despite his frightening strength, was gentle almost to a fault, forever catching falling teacups and steadying wobbling servants before anyone else noticed the danger. And he learned that Dorian, who remembered everything, was still, underneath the calculations, simply a boy who wanted his father to remember his birthday without being reminded. "You're trying," Annie said one evening, finding Alaric in the training yard, watching Ronan patiently teach Cassian, visiting for the week, how to properly hold a wooden practice sword without hurting himself. "I have a great deal to make up for," Alaric said simply. "I intend to keep trying for as long as it takes." Annie was quiet for a moment, watching her sons, watching, too, the surprising tenderness with which they'd folded their small half-brother into their fierce, protective circle without a single moment of resentment. "They forgave you faster than I did," she admitted. "Children are often wiser than kings," Alaric said. "I'm beginning to learn that lesson rather late in life." She almost smiled, almost. "I am not the same woman you broke, Guas," she said quietly. "I don't think I ever will be again. The girl who knelt on that floor 5 years ago and begged you to believe in her, she didn't survive that winter. Someone stronger did." "I know," Alaric said. "I don't want her back. I want to know the woman standing in front of me now, if she'll let me." Annie studied him for a long moment, the man who had once been her whole world, who had shattered that world with his own hands, and who had spent 3 quiet, unglamorous weeks proving, one honest day at a time, that he understood exactly what it would take to be worth trusting again. "Ask me again in a year," she said finally, and there was something warm beneath the words, something that hadn't been there in the banquet hall 3 weeks ago. "If you're still trying this hard by then, Guas, perhaps I'll have an answer worth giving. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't yet love reclaimed. But it was hope, honestly earned instead of desperately demanded. And for a man who had once believed power was measured in how loudly you could command a room, Alaric was finally beginning to understand what his son Dorian had told a border alpha weeks ago, in a hall full of people who thought they already knew what strength looked like. True power is not how much you can take, it is how much you are willing to rebuild. Somewhere in the training yard, Cassian's delighted laughter rang out as Ronan gently caught him mid-stumble, setting him back on his feet with the same quiet care he showed everyone he loved. Kale and Soren sat nearby beneath the old oak tree, deep in some private conversation only twins, even quadruplets, could share. And Dorian, watching it all with his usual careful stillness, finally allowed himself something rare. He smiled. Because whatever came next, whatever slow, uncertain path lay ahead between his mother and the father still learning how to deserve her, for the first time in 5 years, his family was no longer surviving. They were simply, quietly, finally home. If this story moved you, if you felt every ounce of Annie's strength and every second of the king's regret, don't forget to like, share this story with someone who loves a slow burn redemption tale, and subscribe for more powerful werewolf stories like this one.